Good evening, good evening. Hey, we made it, right everybody? Yes. My name is Maria Fernanda. I'm so glad to be here. And we're just gonna get right into it, right? Yours. Who buries bocaditos in their bedroom at 3 in the morning? Jibaro after jibaro, their corners and curves. She tastes Miami and its breeze. She tastes its breeze, then creases the plastic canopies, crackling and mimicking almond tree leaves in the fall. When she rewraps cara marroyo happy in guayaba intact, dulce de coco for Sunday, y pilones resembling cocoons of her childhood, rolling about her palm of her memory as she sings on Hostos campus, from which she prints sheets of music and stretches canvases on wood to bring home, making more hiding places for her candies, which arrive home with me that evening in a United States postal package a month after Hurricane Maria. The cardboard box echoing a church pew songbook in its size, but with edges kissing between the extra tape to hold long past the weeks of rising and landing helicopters. And maybe boats, run by hands of postal carriers, softening down La Calle Verdes before finally returning to work that mid-October in San Sebastian, where her father drove hours to deliver his mail because he craved the wind. Castanier, Puerto Rico. I read the town's name scribbled in a thinning ink on the corner of this box, jumping from the jaw of the narrow-ass dented mailbox in the lobby of our New York apartments, in front of which I make a wish to reserve even this first joy for her, my new roommate, Brisa. I carry her box, eyes closed, to our front door, where Brisa's giggles soar bouts. Her every bitch, yes, sharpens the creases of her smile every time she lists chemicals being injected into our grocery store peanuts, tells me the remedies for sleeping and the ways to befriend this Leo, because you know, Leos, we don't be befriending everybody, but this is the first time Lisa and I laugh and we hit the floor dancing and swinging our flower-patterned skirts, giving the wind its backbone. We sang the Celia's Bemba Colora, to which Brisa cued me in like we've been sisters years ago. And the sun always joins by lending itself to our kitchen. When Brisa opens the package to a limited edition of Cortázar's Hopscotch, a torn news clipping of Primera Ahora, centering its words around a photograph of El Yunque, gleaming before, and now looking like an image in a faded textbook. How it reminds Brisa of her father, a generous man who would take the shirt off his back for anyone, and talk to her on the phone all night about how the people are organizing a little bit more every day, and how the government is helping him now more than ever, which Brisa knows is not the truth. He will not hint at danger, because he wants her to know that he is okay, and that she needs to stay in New York to equal her guitar playing to her singing, and to remember that these sweets will always be how he reminds his Brisa of home, the same way the candies remind him of Brisa, and this is how she buries, this is why she buries los jibaros all over her room like acorns as a means to keep her memory fresh. Thank you so much. Thank you guys. That home means so much to me. For those who may not know, Hurricane Maria happened September 2017, and I had got a new roommate just a month before, so, and she hadn't heard from her father. So I wanted to write that to her to let her know, even though we might not know each other really well, even though we're from different países, there is solidarity in that, right? I'm gonna read a poem that maybe you have received from the lovely Camilo, from the lovely Antonio. Shout out to GALA, by the way, for having us all here tonight. So you might have received a poem. It is actually a form that I'm playing with. It's called, it's by this poet. She's Pakistani-American. Her name is Sarah Hazal Ali. And it's a family tree, so maybe for some of us it looks really familiar. And with family trees, sometimes they have holes in them, right? Sometimes they have names, sometimes they have beginnings and ends we don't recognize. And so, if you want to read along, the poem can be read horizontally as well as vertically. So I'm going to read slow so you can join in with me. All right, mycelium. The old people say that you have to send the young ones on a journey to form themselves, to learn practical things, to manage a canoe, sail, learn the waves, the trees, distinguish good land from bad. This is from Juan Garcia Salazar, who actually did research about palenques, which are free black communities in Ecuador, not just in Esmeraldas. And so this poem is for them. I weave, I fly, my thoughts through into my braids, crisscross the southern, clearing La Decimeras howl over the roads, the river, 44 lines, ripples, hemisphere, quatrains, currents, where palenques bloom for miles, a hum, an opening stanza of the railroads. I learned they change the color of the water. The first railroad we built night into day, sweat and calluses, shaping, healing our palms. Bajans, Jamaicans, Puerto Ricans, Esmeraldans, moonlight cassette tapes of collecting our scissions, our trees, our waves, our lands, forming our bamboo tubes, small bones, orange leaves, tobacco leaves, palm wood for our marimba. Left is our language, outgrowing what we know. Stories embrace tempo and returning to the decima, tenor of even this fabric, woven by hand. La decimera, our history. Now I'll read this vertically on the left side. I weave my thoughts into my braids. La decimeras, where I learn night into moonlight. Cassette tapes of our bamboo tubes, small bones, orange leaves, tobacco leaves outgrowing even this fabric. I'll read the child of my thoughts crisscross the line, if you're still with me. I weave my thoughts crisscross the river, bloom, they change. The color of sweat and calluses, our scissions, our trees, palm wood for stories woven by hand. And lastly, because y'all know I could go on with this one, but I will read it vertically on the right side. I fly through the southern hemisphere, an opening stanza of weave. Asians, Jamaicans, Puerto Ricans, Esmeraldans. Our waves, our land forming is our language. The decima, tenor of our history. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to this evening.
Good evening, everyone. You hear me? Yes. So I was told to come down here after these beautiful words from Maria Fernanda. Let's give her a round of applause. And I have to introduce myself. My name is Eduardo Perdomo. I am the director of Mayor Muriel Bowser's Office on Latino Affairs. And I have the privilege to be the first self-identified Afro-Latino to ever led the office in 48 years of existence. And this is a testament of the inclusionary hiring policies and promotion. I started to work at the Mayor's Office on Latino Affairs, I believe that was almost 8 years ago. In April, will be 8 years ago. And I started as a grants manager. And I never thought that I was gonna be leading one of the most, I think it's the most important institution within DC government to serve the Latino community. And for me, serving my neighbors, it's a wonderful privilege that I will always be grateful for, going through this amazing experience, to be here with you, for instance, tonight, to be able to support these kind of events, to be able to promote the Afro-Latinidad, and to help little by little to construct a society that is more welcoming, not only for a few, but for all of us. And some of the things that we've been able to do, with the Afro Latino Institute in the last couple of years, and I want to please give a round of applause to Antonio Montes, Tony. When he's organizing this kind of events, you see him serious and very, very into the role of production role. But thank you for putting this event together. Also, my querido amigo Celestino Barrera, que anda con su chacabana de invierno. Celestino, muchísimas gracias, Roland, por supuesto, Rolando. Muchísimas gracias. A los panelistas, a todos, thank you very much for being here. I know that you came from a long way, and being here with us, it means a lot. It means a lot because we're helping to spread the word of identities are constructed in a different way, even more when we're here in the United States. Because I was talking just a few moments ago. I myself, like once I'm here, I'm Afro-Latino. Right? But when I'm back in Dominican Republic, I'm just Dominican. And I'm maybe Black Dominican, or maybe un indiecito, right? Porque hay matices de colores, ¿no? And the beauty of these identities is that we construct this as we go through our experiences that are not necessarily interconnected, but not necessarily common, but they're common phrase that we share. And that's very important to keep in mind that there is not such a thing as a common experience, not only for women, for men, for no one. We all have different paths. We all have different tracks, but there are things, system in place that sometimes not necessarily work in our favors, right? So, but the things that we've been doing with the Afro Latino Institute under Mayor Muriel Bowser's administration, who herself is a Black lady, a Black woman, that is the first woman to lead mayor city 3 terms. So she's making history, but not only making history for the sake of like achieving these kind of things, it's for the policy making that we incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion in every policy decision that we have here in the District of Columbia. And that's why we have been able to do some of the elements, part of the discussion points today that you guys are gonna be talking about. For instance, we help with the process of the identity and intersection, Blackness and Latinidad. We organize, and I saw him a few minutes ago, he's there standing already. So Ivan Navas, who is part of, let's give him a round of applause. So Ivan Navas was part of a series of panel discussions that we hosted in Southeast in Washington, D.C., talking about the intersectionality of Black Washingtonians and Afro-Latinos through the lenses of something as beautiful as the music, specifically go-go music. So Ivan, como un maestro, was able to, very latino y el poder compartir no solo con los afrolatinos, pero tratar de llevar la afrolatinidad y la diversidad de todos nosotros a lo más alto de aquí de la ciudad de Washington DC. Así que sean todos bienvenidos y que disfruten la noche. Estamos muy contentos nuevamente por tenerlos a ustedes acá. Así que sepan que la Oficina de Asuntos Latinos de la Alcaldesa Muriel Bowser está abierta para todos. Si alguno de ustedes no conoce la oficina, estamos en hasta quizás el año que viene, en la 2000 de la calle 14. Y allí le podemos ayudar con cualquier cosa. Y lo importante de la oficina es que se ha convertido en esta administración en un vehículo de soporte para todas las comunidades y un vehículo para mejorar la calidad de vida de la gente. Una agencia pequeñita que hace cosas grandes. Muchísimas gracias.
Saludos. Yo soy Omar Ito Martinez. I'm Omar Ito Martinez. I work at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where I help run 28 historic sites across the country. I'm also the board president for the Association of African American Museums, but I was born right here in DC. Yo soy boricua para que lo sepa. I wanted to, before I go on to remarks, make sure that we acknowledge the ambassador of Nicaragua. May you please stand so we can acknowledge him.
Going to pan it when there's like an
Thank you for being here.
I'm happy to pan, but you didn't want me.
Thank you for being
Like
here.
when people are clapping, you want me to pan it in the back?
Again, I was born in DC, raised in
Okay,
Maryland,
okay.
and what I always tell people is that the four walls of the home that my mother and father built for my sister and I, eso fue Puerto Rico, right? Arroz con habichuela, salsa y merengue, right? But when I stepped outside that corridor, that threshold, it became Chocolate City, right? Silver Spring, downtown Silver Spring, where we were raised in Washington, D.C. So, my parents came over here in the 60s. My father worked for NASA, got a Space Flight Center, one of the first Puerto Ricans to work for NASA, when it was a very young agency. My mother came after already teaching 7 years in San Dulce and taught 34 years in Oyster bilingual. Now known as Oyster Island, right? So we have a lot of history with this town around Afro-Latinidad and Puerto Ricanness for sure. And so if anybody went to Oyster from 68 to 2002, my mother was probably the teacher. Okay. She's right here. Raise your hand, mommy. I want to give big thanks for the poet Maria Fernanda.
Administración.
From West Coast to East Coast, and even the diaspora you're speaking of. Definitely big shout out to Eduardo Perdomo making history up in here. I mean, first Black Latino, that's amazing. And I also want to acknowledge Abel Lopez. He's been doing this for a long time. He's the associate producer here at the GALA Theatre. And of course, I have a special acknowledgement for mi primo querido, Rolando Roba. If you don't know who he is, just tap the person next to you, and he or she probably has 2 or 3 stories for you. Right? So I want to acknowledge him. I want to acknowledge Celestino and Tony from Afro Latino Institute for really welcoming the Absolutamente Negro group here. And we are doing this Practice of Freedom conversation series in DC. We had our first one that was virtual in New York, and we're going to go around the country and continue to bring up these important conversations around Afro-Latinidad. I have to take a moment to acknowledge the Queen, Dr. Vega. Listen, institution builder. I mean, if you don't have it, if it doesn't fit, she's gonna pave a way and make it, right? Caribbean Cultural Center, African Diaspora Institute. Creative Justice Initiative, co-founder of Corredor Afro in Puerto Rico. I mean, come on. We stand on Black women's shoulders all day, so let's not act brand new about it now. And of course, just again, special shout out to my mother who raised me. Love you, mommy. Thank you for my sister being here, and I think my wife and kids are on their way as well. But I want to get into why we're here. So this began with an idea, a vision, and deep conversations from Afro-Latino historians and cultural advocates dedicated to celebrating and safeguarding our rich legacy as an essential part of the African diaspora. Concurrently, we observed unsettling events in 2022, pervasive racial incidents spanning from West Coast to East Coast, and even reaching Caribbean nations and territories. And one of the things that I really like about the group that Dr. Vega and Josue put together is that we really intentionally created spaces to disrupt this idea that Afro-Latinos only exist in one part of our country. We know that we're everywhere, and that's important for me to call out. These events included, in 2022, attempts to erase our history, prohibit our expressions, our words, enact laws displacing our communities, and intentionally instigate cultural wars to foster division and dominance. Colonialism is real, and this division is a vestige of that. From Puerto Rico, where an Afro-Boricua family faced constant racist harassment due to their skin tone, to other parts of the nation, we witnessed similar racially motivated actions and biased legislations that limited our human and women's rights. Well, a lot of us were motivated by these things, including Dr. Vega and Josue, who really wanted to put together this idea of having these in-depth conversations and having a diverse, multi-generational group of scholars, cultural advocates, and communicators, which is the group I'm part of. It's the advisory board for Absolutamente Negro. Let's give it up for Absolutamente Negro. Out of these exchanges, a nationwide collaboration among the Afro-Latino, Latina, Latinx, and Latinx community blossomed. This joint effort engaged the Creative Justice Initiative, the Afro-Latino Forum, and our advisory board. Armed with the wisdom imparted by our peers and communities, we've curated and disseminated a cultural educational series. Our profound aspiration is to nurture solidarity, unity, and mutual understanding within the Afro-Latino, Afro-Latina, Latinx, and Latinx community, and the broader African diaspora, aiming to shape a brighter, inclusive, and equitable future for the upcoming generations. I want to welcome you, audience, to this space. Bienvenidos. I want to also welcome and acknowledge that at the end, we're going to have another great poet, Angela C. Gibb, who will be performing poem at the closing. And let me tell you something. This sister's fierce. I remember first seeing her on the Negro docuseries with Dash Harris. That is, if you haven't seen it, go look for it on YouTube. It's an excellent docuseries. But I also want to say that I think we need to vote for a poet to be president. I think we'd have a much different country. I'm just saying, I love poets, so that's my pitch. So please welcome the panelists, and we're gonna bring up the moderator, Jose Calderon, who's the president of the Hispanic Federation, which is the nation's premier Latino nonprofit membership organization. He will come forward and introduce the panelists to you and really start this engaging conversation. Muchísimas gracias.
Buenas tardes. So I'm going to ask the panelists to join me on stage. If you can, and we'll introduce them once they get up here. And make give you a hand in.
full understanding with
really don't, right?
the moderator.
My immediate left here is Kayla Kaysen, who is the former vice president and co-president of Chango, the Afro-Latin Student Association and Spanish-speaking society at Howard University. Give it up for Kayla. To Kayla's immediate left is, well, I think he's been introduced like 4 or 5 times already. Roland Raubach, president of Afro Latino Institute. Give it up for Roland. And Dr. Marta Moreno, I'm reading it, sorry. Dr. Anita Gonzalez, co-founding lead of the Racial Justice Institute of Georgetown University and professor of Performing Arts and Global Black Studies, Dr. Anita Gonzalez. Give it up for
Okay, when they talk. Okay.
So as I said, I am super excited about this conversation because it's a conversation we certainly don't have nearly enough. We really don't, right? When we talk about sort of Afro-Latinidad and what that means, it is essential reality, an issue to understanding who we are as a people, to understanding our history, to understanding where we're going, to understanding, again, the complexities within our realities, our lived realities. And it's essential in terms of
enslaved people in Maryland.
I'm gonna be, for the most part, be very quiet and allow you to have unfettered access to this amazing group of panelists, and actually wanted to say that, you know, when I was growing up, and we had very little images, right, positive images of our identity, right? We didn't even have, really, for the most part, Latina history of any kind, let alone a history focused on Afro-Latinidad, right? But what I do remember when I was young is that we did have a reporter, his name was Pablo Guzman. He recently passed away. Yes. And when I remember, like, growing up in New York, right, and seeing a Latino on television, in this case an Afro-Latino on television, the incredible sense of pride that I had. I didn't know at the time, I was relatively young, that he was one of the co-founders of the Young Lords.
Come on, talk about it.
Which was a movement, an organization, a party that was created to mirror the Black Panther Party, right? And it was a movement around liberation, around Puerto Rican independence, around community empowerment. And Pablo was one of the leaders of that movement, right? And he eventually became a journalist. But also Pablo had adopted the name Yoruba as his sort of middle name, right? To really, again, you know, lift up his Africanness, to lift up his centering sort of Blackness in his experience. And to me, in going back and sort of reading after he passed away, some of his, you know, some of the things that he had written. One of the things that he actually mentioned was that for him, you know, that he saw many light-skinned Puerto Ricans unable to identify with the Black struggles that he was seeing in New York City. But him as you know, self-described Black Puerto Rican, like that, he was part of that struggle. That struggle was his, as much as the struggle for Puerto Rican, you know, empowerment was his as well too. And he got that instinctively because he said, I'm not gonna repeat exactly what he said, but he said, you know, before they called me the S word, they called me the N word.
Talk about it.
Right? And every time that he stepped outside, that's how people saw me. And so we often talk about, again, that duality, right, of being an Afro-Latina, Latino, Latine, and living that sort of experience, right, of, again, being part of both groups, right, but not fully embraced by both groups. So I really want to sort of open the stage, right, for the panelists, and this is for all three panelists, to talk about that lived experience of that duality, and again, that sense of not fully being embraced in you know, sort of, we can put it in both groups or both camps. So why don't we start with Anita?
Hello, thank you for being here. I was thinking when you talked about identity, the first thing I want to talk about is invisibility. Because I've worked so much in like working with like Afro-Mexican populations, and until you're visible, you can't have resources, you can't have funding, you can't articulate who or what you are.
a Black conscious
That lived experience of that duality, and again,
that there was
sort of, we can put it in.
And that's like the groundwork from which we're moving forward. And I'm gonna let Roland talk next because we were sharing a story about my father's experience growing up. He's the Cubano, and growing up in Florida. And when I would say to him, Daddy, why don't you like talk about being Cubano? And he'd say, let me tell you, they have a little song. They may call you Hawaiian and you may play the ukulele, but when you go outside the door, you're just a plain to me. Wow.
For me, the issue of identity is very, very crucial. Growing up in Puerto Rico, my racial awareness was zero, meaning that I did not have a clear concept of my Blackness within my own barrio. But as I grew up and moved in different circles, I began to see that there was scientifically based segregation. I did not see Blacks or Afro-Puerto Ricans in banks, in important institutions, and there was a fear of discussing race within that community. It's only after I leave Puerto Rico and go to the Air Force that I began to develop a Black consciousness. And I blame the educational system in Puerto Rico that tends to deny or suffocate the aspirations of Afro-Puerto Ricans in the island. But I must also include that we cannot assume that all light-skinned Puerto Ricans are racist, because in my neighborhood, I was accepted in different circles that were housed by white Puerto Ricans. So we need to be very careful with respect to how we label certain individuals and their commitment to mitigate the evilness of racism. Now, my presence here in Washington, D.C. was very critical in understanding that there were Afro-Latinos throughout Central and South America, because I was not aware. You see, and the folk that are creating this scientific-based distance among groups have done a tremendous job. They have used the educational system to divide, to confuse, and to deny our rightful presence in the Hispanic experience. And this is a calculated effort. And it's manifested not only in the Caribbean, but also in throughout South America. Because my position is that all Spanish-speaking countries are racist. That's my position. Now, there are various degrees depending on the number of Afro-Latinos in those countries, but I challenge and I ask members of the white Hispanic community to become more conscious with respect to the plight that we are facing and join us in trying to mitigate that evil, cancerous racism that is really choking us.
That's kind of heavy to follow up on, but very, very true, very, very honest. I'm going to share a little bit about my experiences growing up in Washington Heights, or at least Inwood, New York City. So if you don't know, that neighborhood or that community is predominantly Dominican, predominantly Puerto Rican, Mexican, Hispanic kids. So when I was going to elementary school, you know, kids talk, whatever, we're having discussions at the cafeteria table, and we get into this conversation about music, and we're talking about hip hop and R&B. And I remember, I don't know how we got here, but I remember saying to one of my friends, oh, you know you're Black, right? And
completely
it happened maybe like 3rd grade. So now I'm going through life kind of confused between the difference of Blackness and Latinidad. Whole time there's no real difference. It's all one and the same because we all come from these same people. So when I'm learning more about identity, I'm learning more about my own identity, it's becoming more of a conversation of, is there a difference or not? Where is this line? How do I identify myself, and how do people understand the identity that I am offering to them, if that makes sense? So when I start to apply for schools and I start to think about where I want to go for college, I think more subconsciously I realize that I want to go to a place where I can further educate myself on my own identity, because again, there's still this division in my head. Am I Black and Latino, or am I just Black? Am I Afro-Latino? Who am I for real? So I think coming to a place like Howard University, coming to a space where I can learn a little bit more, educate myself a little bit more about what this identity looks like to other people, has helped me identify with myself more. So now, fast forward 4 years later, or 3.5 years later, I'm finished with school, and I can say, oh, I am Afro-Latino, because there is no real division between the two. You know what I'm saying? So as we talk about education, as we talk about the way we socialize with one another, it's also important that we understand how we express our own identities, because it influences the way people express themselves. So, you know, it's bigger than just the people who are teaching us about our history, but how we teach each other about each other as well.
So this is heavy, right? Like this is heavy, and again, these are conversations I love. By the way, the stage, right? It's like, you know, you're at home, but these are the conversations that we need to be having at the kitchen table, right? We need to be having in every single kind of forum imaginable, and by and large, they don't happen, right? I mean, I certainly, growing up within sort of the Dominican context, like, you know, again, you know, completely shied away from that, right? And we had, you know, uninterrupted miseducation, right? Going, first of all, just to be a colonized people, right? All of us that have lived under colonization, right, or the effects of colonization, we have all been miseducated, right? In the case of the Dominican Republic, there's been extreme miseducation, right, for certain political reasons. And so, you know, to me, getting here to the United States was the first opportunity that I had to sort of explore, you know, the concept of identity and sort of who we are as a people and where do we come from. And, you know, again, why do we eat plátanos, right? And, you know, and those things, right? And again, a historical standpoint, and, you know, the great Colombian writer, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, shed light on the fact that Latin America is a place where magical realism is alive, right? He shed light on the fact that, again, the lines of reality and fantasy are blurred, right? He sort of shed light on the fact that a myth often becomes fact. And I
because they came from.
They don't happen, right? This education of our people. What do we need to do? And I know that's going to touch on a multitude of issues around education, representation. You mentioned that, Anita, right? Again, being present, coalition building, institution development, leadership development, et cetera, et cetera. But we really need to dive into that because it's not that the work started now, right? Dr. Marta Moreno Vega has been leading that effort for decades and decades. And there have been so many other voices that have been fighting that fight, right? So this is not new, but at this particular moment in time, what is it that we need to do better, right? To strengthen, right? To educate people, to educate our own people around sort of our Afro-Latino roots, right?
I think we need to have a lot more conversations like this. I was thinking, there were so many things I was thinking.
Come up with the question. So the issue of education become extremely, extremely critical in transforming the mind of folk. I would like to see a panel of all white folk, I'll say about 5 or 6, so they can explain to us the joys, the benefits of exercising racism towards Afro-Latinos. I would love to do that. As a matter of fact, I will even volunteer to be the moderator of that panel. I don't want you to do it. I want to do it. And I will come up with the questions, etc. Because we're giving white people a pass. We're not becoming militant. We are becoming sort of soft in our approach. And I think that we need to be a little bit more forceful in our advocacy, in our educational approach, and be very militant in our litigation. When was the last time that a group of Afro-Latinos sued X company? We are too passive. We are like flan. You know flan? So my interest is not to be flanesque in my approach. My approach is based on militancy and exposing folk that are racist. A lot of people in DC are afraid when Roland Roebuck is holding a mic because they don't know what the hell I'm gonna say. But historically, I have been very, very inflexible with my advocacy. And I'm hoping that others will embrace that posture in order to change the equation.
I'm sorry, Kayla. We're gonna switch this up next time. You'll speak before Roland.
You know, people are surprised that I'm sitting here being very serious because that's not my perfil.
No, well, everything you said is very, very true. As provocative as it is, it's a fact. Because if you do not expose the truth of what's going on, the truth, like, the issues will still be the issues, no matter how long you fight those issues, if the root of the cause is not uprooted. And you have to talk to the people who cause those issues. And if they're not willing to, they might be a little hesitant to speak, and that's okay. You know, you can't really force everybody, but you have to at least immerse those people into this conversation that we're having. Because yes, it's beautiful to have a room full of all of us, but everybody else needs to be in this room as well. So to have people who look like us, don't look like us, be immersed in our experiences and our culture and our foods and our concerns about the world and our lives, that is what's going to push forward our progress, and have people who look like us but also who don't look like us fight for the issues that we all see around us, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
So, you know, everything that they've mentioned is so critically important, and I think about, of course, right, like, part of this work is about education, right? Being a leader means that you are to educate others, right? I mean, that's inherent in sort of that description, sort of that you know, that term, right, of leadership. We have to do a better job of educating everyone. And that means our own people, but that means others as well too, right? And I think it is difficult when all systems are set up, right, to miseducate our communities, right? And in the broader sense, our communities, right, around our identity. And again, it's a historical, right, you know, miseducation. And so I think part of the work, which I think Roland highlighted, right, is about, and I'd love to see that panel, by the way. We may have to sponsor that. You know, because I do think it's important, right, to educate people who haven't walked in your shoes, right? People who don't understand. I think, Kayla, you know, we have an opportunity with our young people. Like, our young people are much more receptive. They've been, you know, they're more worldly in that respect, right? I think, Roland, you mentioned you didn't know, right, that there were, you know, Black people throughout, you know, the Americas, right, until you got here, right? I think, you know, that there's a reason for that, right? I mean, we just weren't taught those things back home. And so I think now, with so many movements that are afoot here, progressive movements, right, around liberation and around social justice, I think our young people, right, have a better opportunity to create a better world, or have an opportunity to create a better world, right, by sort of opening up their minds more readily. But speaking of sort of, again, the creation of a better world, we're not in a good place, right? We're not in a good place nationally. In fact, as all of you know, we have national elections this year, right? And the fact is that we have other movements afoot, right? That wish to turn back the clock on everything that we have fought for. Certainly everything we have fought for probably since the founding of this republic. You know, the whole notion of civil rights, right? They want to turn back the clock completely. Diversity and inclusion, right? Representation, and basically, you know, the movements, right, which are all sort of joined around the premise of, again, reaffirming and reestablishing and cementing white supremacy as the law of the land, right? We know that that's very real. We know that that's very much tied into our national elections today. Knowing that, right, and understanding that, I kind of think about something that you were sharing with me, Anita, beforehand, about the need for us to be better at building coalitions, and particularly with the African American community, right? Being Afro-Latino means sort of having, sort of a foot in both places, but again, ni de aquí ni de allá, never fully being embraced. And when we think about sort of the Black experience, and certainly when we think about the African American community, we have a shared agenda, which is very clear. But the forces of division, the forces that have, in some ways, sort of programmed, and actually, Pablo Guzman talked about this, like we have been programmed to stand apart, right? What do we have to do to break down those barriers, those walls that have existed between our people, right? People who, again, have been disenfranchised, have been historically marginalized, and share, right?
38. I got it.
Almost an
It's
identical
probably
agenda
enough
when
so
you
far.
sort of
We still
go down the line. When you talk about whether it's healthcare, education, talk about economic empowerment, we talk about representation, et cetera, right? How do we do a better job at building something that will be sustainable, right? Because we have built a true coalition, right, that is really looking at the empowerment of all of our people. Let me start with Roland.
All right. In order to achieve, there is a difference between coalitions and coalition. Coalition is shocking, okay? If we look at a national level, who are our Afro-Latino leaders? If I ask each one of you, name 3 national Afro-Latino leaders, you'll
I
have,
have 3 right here.
yeah, beside us. You will have a hard time identifying those individuals. The point that I'm trying to make is that in order to set up the forum in which you're gonna have this coalition building discussion, you need to have some legitimate leaders that can coalesce the folk in order to engage in the discussion. That's one. And number 2, where are you gonna have that discussion? And what is the outcome? I mean, because we talk and we talk and we talk and we talk and more talk, but we do not come up with concrete action. If I ask again the members of the audience, give me the platform for the Afro-Latino Community 2024. Boop, nada. Okay, so we have to be very conscious of folk that look like us, but have sold their soul in order to appease white folk, and they're doing a detrimental job in sabotaging our potentiality for coalitions. We are not shaming individuals that look like us, but have a different agenda. We are nice. Somos buenos. Somos santitos. Y no damos macetazos donde tenemos que dar los macetazos. So, without having critical leaders that can coalesce, you're not gonna have the opportunity to design an effective agenda for transformation. So young leaders need to be coached by us, los viejos, so they can do the work for the future.
Thank you, Roland. Yeah. I would say for sure. I mean, this is why we're doing this work, right? And this is why Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, right, felt that this was so important to have these conversations, because it is very much around building an agenda for us, by us, right, with us, and bringing that forward, right, to everyone, right, to people outside of our community, certainly within the community, But that's why these conversations are so critically important, right? So the voices that we hear here today, and the voices that are going to be in the audience that we're going to hear from in a few minutes, are critically important in developing that agenda, right? And I think, by the way, we would not have a hard time in this room coming up with an agenda, right? I think it's clear, sort of again, the fight that we have. So, Anita, I do want to focus in on this piece around the acceptance of the African American community.
Yeah, I was going to say, this coalition building has to happen with the African American community, but it's also an educational project. I mean, what he was saying before, people are like, oh, you're just speaking that Mexican stuff, right? As if it's a separate experience from what it is to be a Black person in the Americas. I mean, there is a unity, at least among the people in this room. We mostly live here, right? And when we go outside the door, people are like, oh, you Black. And then when we approach the African American communities, let's call them the English-speaking communities, because I want us to think about how the colonial languages are the only thing dividing us, because the racism is the same, right? So we need to start having coalitions between the French-speaking Blacks and the Spanish-speaking Blacks and the English-speaking Blacks. And I do so much work in the Caribbean, and you're all like one island away, you know what I mean? From the next person who speaks a different language, and there's a Creole language going on. But I don't think that each of the different lingual communities are actually reaching out to the others. Exactly. So the coalition building has to happen. I mean, we're all talking about Blackness. You're talking about anti-racism. You're talking about racism in American society. When you were speaking about the current politics, I was thinking about the double bind, right? Like we have people at the border, and the ones they show you on TV are the ones who happen to be Black, so that you can again layer on top of that the criminality that we assume of African Americans. So now they're immigrant criminals also at the border who happen to be Black. But all of it is about this kind of white supremacy and colonial culture that's defining all of our lives. So in terms of the coalition building, we have to educate the other groups that it's only about a language difference, you know? And then, of course, there's cultural distinctions, but the coalitions, I mean, I wish there were more people from the African American community here. I'm so glad he's working in the mayor's office, right? She sees it. How many other people can we get to really recognize that we need more unity in order to create a coalition that can be politically activist?
So, Caleb, you know, obviously you basically, so you get to Howard University.
With concrete action. If I ask again the members of the audience, give me the platform for the Afro-Latino Community 2024. Boop. Nada. Okay, so we have to be very conscious of folk that look like us, but have sold their soul in order to appease white folk, and they're doing a detrimental job in sabotaging our potentiality for coalitions. We are not shaming individuals that look like us, but have a different agenda. We are nice. Somos buenos. Somos santitos. Y no damos macetazos donde tenemos que dar los macetazos. So, without having critical leaders that can coalesce, you're not going to have the opportunity to design an effective agenda for transformation. So young leaders need to be coached by us, los viejos, so they can do the work for the future.
Thank you, brother. Yeah. And I would say for sure, I mean, this is why we're doing this work, right? And this is why Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, right, felt that this was so important to have these conversations, because it is very much around building an agenda for us, by us, right, with us, and bringing that forward, right, to everyone, right, to people outside of our community, certainly within the community. But that's why these conversations are so critically important, right? So the voices that we hear here today, and the voices that are going to be in the audience that we're going to hear from in a few minutes, are critically important in developing that agenda, right? And I think, by the way, we would not have a hard time in this room coming up with an agenda, right? I think it's clear, sort of again, the fight that we have. So, Anita, I do want to focus in on this piece around the acceptance of the African American community.
Yeah, I was going to say, this coalition building has to happen with the African American community, but it's also an educational project. I mean, what he was saying before, people are like, oh, you're just speaking that Mexican stuff, right? As if it's a separate experience from what it is to be a Black person in the Americas. I mean, there is a unity, at least among the people in this room. We mostly live here, right? And when we go outside the door, people are like, oh, you Black. And then when we approach the African American communities, let's call them the English-speaking communities, because I want us to think about how the colonial languages are the only thing dividing us, because the racism is the same, right? So we need to start having coalitions between the French-speaking Blacks and the Spanish-speaking Blacks and the English-speaking Blacks. And I do so much work in the Caribbean, and you're all like one island away, you know what I mean? From the next person who speaks a different language, and there's a Creole language going on. But I don't think that each of the different lingual communities are actually reaching out to the others. Exactly. So the coalition building has to happen. I mean, we're all talking about Blackness. You're talking about anti-racism. You're talking about racism in American society. When you were speaking about the current politics, I was thinking about the double bind, right? Like we have people at the border, and the ones they show you on TV are the ones who happen to be Black, so that you can again layer on top of that the criminality that we assume of African Americans. So now they're immigrant criminals also at the border who happen to be Black. But all of it is about this kind of white supremacy and colonial culture that's defining all of our lives. So in terms of the coalition building, we have to educate the other groups that it's only about a language difference, you know? And then, of course, there's cultural distinctions, but the coalitions, I mean, I wish there were more people from the African American community here. I'm so glad he's working in the mayor's office, right? She sees it. How many other people can we get to really recognize that we need more unity in order to create a coalition that can be politically activist?
So, Kayla, you know, obviously you basically, so you get to Howard University. Important to have these conversations, because it is very much around building an agenda for us, by us, right, with us, and bringing that forward, right, to everyone, right, to people outside of our community, certainly within the community. But that's why these conversations are so critically important, right? So the voices that we hear here today, and the voices that are going to be in the audience that we're going to hear from in a few minutes, are critically important in developing that agenda. Right? And I think, by the way, we would not have a hard time in this room coming up with an agenda, right? I think it's clear, sort of again, the fight that we have. So, Anita, I do want to focus focusing on this piece around the acceptance of the African American community.
Yeah, I was gonna say, this coalition building has to happen with the African American community, but it's also an educational project. I mean, what he was saying before, people are like, oh, you're just speaking that Mexican stuff, right? As if it's a separate experience from what it is to be a Black person in the Americas. I mean, there is a unity, at least among the people in this room. We mostly live here, right? And when we go outside the door, people are like, oh, you Black. And then when we approach the African American communities, let's call them the English-speaking communities, because I want us to think about how the colonial languages are the only thing dividing us, because the racism is the same, right? So we need to start having coalitions between the French-speaking Blacks and the Spanish-speaking Blacks and the English-speaking Blacks. And I do so much work in the Caribbean, and you're all like one island away, you know what I mean? From the next person who speaks a different language, and there's a Creole language going on, but I don't think that each of the different lingual communities are actually reaching out to the others. Exactly. So the coalition building has to happen. I mean, we're all talking about Blackness, you're talking about anti-racism, you're talking about racism in American society. When you were speaking about the current politics, I was thinking about the double bind, right? Like we have people at the border, and the ones they show you on TV are the ones who happen to be Black, so that you can again layer on top of that the criminality that we assume of African Americans. So now they're immigrant criminals also at the border who happen to be Black. But all of it is about this kind of white supremacy and colonial culture that's defining all of our lives. So in terms of the coalition building, we have to educate the other groups that it's only about a language difference, you know? And then, of course, there's cultural distinctions, but the coalitions, I mean, I wish there were more people from the African American community here. I'm so glad he's working in the mayor's office, right? She sees it. How many other people can we get to really recognize that we need more unity in order to create a coalition that can be politically activist?
So, Caleb, you know, obviously you basically, so you get to Howard University.
Coalition that can be politically activist.
So, Caleb, you know, obviously you basically, so you get to Howard University. Of sort of lifting this up and making sure that within Howard University, a historically African American college, that this was given, you know, weight, right? That it was given due respect, and that it was, you know, someplace that could be attractive to everyone and important for everyone to know sort of this experience?
So I remember sophomore year of college, because freshman year, COVID year, so that was all online, all at home. But when I finally get to campus, beginning of the year, we usually have this thing called a student org fair. So all student organizations will come out and they'll set up their little tables and they'll do their little intro. Here I am, this is what we do, come join our club. So I'm excited, I'm looking around, I'm walking around, I see the African Student Association, I see the Caribbean Student
That can be political.